Today's event concerns the very question of freedom. So it's a concept that is very relevant at the moment with the COVID pandemic, but also something that businesses, NGOs, and trade unions have been trying to achieve for workers in global supply chains for many years. I'm Cristina Talens, and I'm the head of Business Risk Assessment Services here at the Wilberforce Institute, and I'm going to be chair this afternoon. I am the daughter of migrant workers who came to the UK in the 1980s, and so I think the answer to the question of freedom will depend very much on the angle that you're looking at this from. So very, very happy to be chair of this session today and to explore this question with the panel. So this afternoon, we're going to be hearing from 9 short presentations from individuals who've been working on labour and human rights and supply chains for many years. One of our participants has been trying to join us from Nepal, so I'm hoping you'll bear with us through any technical hitches, as he will be giving us a very much needed worker voice here today. I actually counted up how long our speakers had been working on the issue of freedom and labour and human rights, and collectively they have more than 150 years worth of experience between them. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and then just tell us what freedom means to them, as well as the one thing that they believe would have the greatest impact in ensuring freedom for workers. I will then start a series of questions to get a discussion going between the panelists. And during this time, you are all welcome to ask questions, which we'll ask you to send in by writing. If you look to the right of the screen, you should see a questions tab. And you can obviously submit your questions at any time, but we're going to save them until after their responses have been delivered. And I think we will have about 45 minutes at the end of the discussion to just go through your questions. I'll be reading the questions out to the speakers because of the platform that we're using, which means that you in the audience can't be seen or heard, so I'm sorry about that. But given that we've got a lot of people here today, we may not be able to ask all of your questions, but any question that we don't get through, we'll pass on to the speaker at the end. So, as I said, we have 9 speakers today, and our first speaker is Durba Mija from Nepal. Durba was a migrant worker in Malaysia and today works with migrant workers in Nepal. Durba, I don't know if you are there, but if you are, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you? Over to you, Durba. Can't hear. We can see you. Durba, try to take the earphones out.
Hi.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well done. It's been difficult. Thank you for joining us. Did you hear my question, Durba?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Do you want to tell us? Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom is to you?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Okay. This is Durba, and I'm from Nepal. Actually, I'm very sorry because my place having rain with storm and thunder and lightning, so little problem with electricity and connection. So this is Durba, and I work in electronics company called ST Micro Malaysia for 4 years since 2015, and returned to Nepal in 2019. As a migrant worker, being able to say yes or no is freedom for me. So normally a migrant worker uh, lose their confidence in overseas. They always have to accept whatever their uh, employer say about working terms and conditions. We need to work as their choice, sometimes long hours, sometimes very less hour, any random work. So being able to say I don't want to work for long hours or refuse to those work which I'm not comfortable or skilled to do is freedom for me. So migrants have live in crowded dormitory with hundreds of other workers, sometimes in same big hall room, need to wait long times for go to the toilets and for take shower, no privacy at all. Sometimes not allowed to cook their own food, and they are forced to eat those food which they never ate or they don't like. So being able to say I want privacy in my life, or I cannot live with hundreds of other people, or I want eat this kind of food, this is also freedom for me. So protection by employer always build our confidence and always encourage migrant to do work happily uh, and freely. But most of the situation doesn't happen like that. As a migrant, low confidence, low language skill, uh, uh, they always abused, and if they make any report instead of justice, they always get problems for themselves. Yes, they don't get proper interpretation, and employers sometimes don't understand even the issue properly, and result will be like sometimes even they send back victim migrant to home. Being able to express our problems very properly is also a freedom for me. Worker not free also to stay in their country due to bad social and economic situation. Worker not free to deny overtime as they will lose for whole month or year maybe, and they're desperate for money also. Worker cannot refuse sexual advance or be punished. Worker always say yes. When I want to go back to home, I should decide, not employer or anyone else. Uh, when I want to take leave and I want to meet my family, that should be my choice. What I want to eat or cook, what religion I want to follow, with respect others, these things should be chosen by myself, not anyone else. So all these things, in my point of view, this is the freedom for a migrant. As a migrant, a former migrant, I feel this should be freedom for them.
Thank you very much, Durba. If you could think of one big change that would have the most impact on workers' freedom, what do you think it would be? I know there's probably quite a few, but if one big change, what would it be?
Okay, honesty should be first key in my point of view. Employer should be honest. Recruitment agencies should be honest, not try to be honest only by papers. Should make aware workers before leave their country, should do counsel them and build their confidence, need effective complaint mechanism and customer, buyer or related concern bodies support. That's all I
Okay.
think.
Thank you very much, Durba. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for struggling through and joining us on the call. You've done really well.
Yeah.
I'm really happy to have your insights with us today because you bring a very much needed worker voice to this question. So I'm going to be counting on you to keep us grounded as we talk about initiatives for migrant workers later on. Next, we have Nick Kitely, who is Strategic Lead for Food, Farming and Fisheries at the Ethical Trading Initiative. For those of you who don't know the ETI, it's an alliance of companies, trade unions and NGOs that promotes respect for workers' rights around the world. So Nick, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you, as well as what you think is the one thing that could have the greatest impact on ensuring freedom for workers.
Thanks, Cristina. So yes, I'm the strategic lead at ETI for food, farming and fisheries. And I think for me, following on from somebody such as Derba, of course, whose practical experience of being a migrant worker is really challenging. For me, I can only think of something really much more simple to say, which is around the fact that freedom is my right, our right, to be both heard and also for our views to be respected as a stakeholder. Trying to pack a few things into a short sentence there, and that relates both to the work environment and also to my life in the community and life outside work. So I see it as a right. I want my views to be heard and to be respected or taken seriously. And I think that's the start of freedom for me. And I guess looking at the world around us, we can see there's a big shortage of freedom. We can see lack of freedom in so many places. And so I ask myself why, after all these years, and with so many of us knowing so much about the fact that workers do have rights, that we have freedom, that slavery is wrong, why is progress so slow? What is holding us back? What is it about the way that businesses function and states work that means that progress is so slow in so many places? And I would just speculate as the beginning of this webinar that possibly one of those things is in particularly the lack of workers being able to have their voice heard and to be represented by such as trades unions. Perhaps one of those reasons is the pressure that suppliers, who are the employers of workers, may be experiencing from the buying community in terms of the competitive pressure, the squeeze down on prices, the pressure to agree to contracts, competitive bidding contracts, which end up forcing companies to then not give due consideration to workers and worker costs. So you may end up with a contract that doesn't fully reflect the legal full costs of production when they agree to a price. And then that locks in a whole series of activities and events which ultimately do exploit workers just because there is so little maneuvering room, even when suppliers may be well-intentioned. So I would just put that out as one of the considerations we might have today, that a driving force for the lack of freedoms is the fact that the trading relationships, the power imbalances and the mechanisms by which business is done force the most vulnerable to become squeezed and exploited.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for that introduction, for those thoughts. And that leads us very nicely onto Alfonso Herias, who heads up the ethical team at Cheese Fresh. This is one of Europe's leading fresh food produce companies, and it has over 10,000 workers in its supply chains. So, Alfonso, following on from that, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom is to you, as well as what you think is the one thing that would have the greatest impact on ensuring freedom for workers? Over to you.
Thank you, Cristina. Thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure and honor being part of this panel. And thanks everybody watching us in this afternoon. So, as you said, I'm the Group Ethics Manager of Cheese Fresh, one of the Europeans' leading farming business. We are a major supplier to all European and American supermarkets, mostly on salads. I've been working on social issues over 10 years, and most recently, over the last 6 years, in the agricultural industry, in ethical trade and human rights issues. So just to try to build a little bit on what just Nick said, what freedom means to me Okay, let's get back to the original concept. What freedom is actually, it's the act of the right of to choose something, to choose who to work for, to choose who to be in love with, etc. Sometimes we tend to link this concept, the lack of freedom in supply chains, to the most extreme versions of this absence of freedom, which is, you know, the severe case of labor exploitations, modern slavery cases. Sometimes our brain immediately goes to, you know, to Nepal, to India, to other places. But I think, and as I said, trying to build a little bit in what just Nick said, I think it's important also, don't forget the most immediate manifestation of this lack of freedom. Because freedom is not just, you know, being forced to work to one business, to one employer. And lack of freedom is also, you know, not having the freedom to choose your career path, your work-life balance, to be forced to do excessive excessive working hours, to not know when your shift is going to finish. So I can carry on, you know, listing a number of issues that we could consider minor, but at the end of the day, you know, fit this this idea that, you know, nowadays we have a vulnerable workforce all over the world, not just in developing countries. So in this regard, I think this is not just important to recognize a breach when it happens. A breach might happen in the UK, in Spain, in Switzerland. But also, I think the moment we start accepting, or at least turning the blind eye to these minor breaches of freedom, or we're gonna start seeing in a more distant way the more extreme expressions we see perhaps in the news. So we need to, what I'm trying to say is we need to be very critical with our newer environment, with our own life, with our own work. We need to use the tools we have to actually to share our views, to challenge our employer if we can, and if not, use all the options available in our country, because this is very important, because otherwise we won't be able to address the most extreme cases. And then reference to your second question, what I think is the most, the thing that will have the most important impact on aiming this, this freedom for all workers. But there are several, I think, several factors that can contribute to achieve this goal. It's still amazing that nowadays in 2020 we're still talking about this, something that has been going on for centuries, and actually the records tell us that the situation is quite, it's worse nowadays. But looking into the more practical progress we made, I think this progress was made because we managed to bring the consumers on our side. We managed to convince the consumers that we can't accept these practices, and as a consumers we have a vote, and that vote is that purchase we make, that T-shirt we buy, that bag of salad we buy. So and that's very important, because that will drive all the pressure all the way through to the business. It will bring other stakeholders along. It will bring the media along. It will bring more NGOs along, and will create an environment that will promote, freedom, will promote more ethical working practices. But we also, on the other hand, we need to be very careful, because it's very easy to say, yeah, we need to be more ethical. We need to be more, we need to be more ethical when we buy any products, any items. We should feel guilty if we see a T-shirt that costs £1. But the problem is not everybody can afford that nowadays, and the situation, the trend is again getting worse. So we need to acknowledge that we need to create, as a society, the conditions for all consumers to actually make ethical decisions, because not everybody can afford a underwear that is produced by an ethical company, because it will cost maybe 2-3 times more than an underwear that you can buy in a high street retail. Same with food. Not everybody in big cities can go to that fancy supermarket that has the nice products that that is being brought by cooperatives, and you have more certainty about the working conditions. So we need to be very careful, don't get too easy in assumptions, and try to build as a society those conditions for everybody to use their critical thinking and make the right choices.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfonso. That followed nicely from what Nick was saying. Next, I'd like to introduce Steve Gibbons, who is director of Ergen Associates. It's an independent private company that works with organizations on labor standards, human rights, and gender equality. And Steve's worked with governments, with international organizations around the question of human rights. So Steve, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you, as well as what you think is the thing that would have the greatest impact on ensuring freedom for workers?
Mute me. Yeah, good. Excellent. Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. I'll be very, very brief because I know you've got lots of people to come in, and we've only got sort of an hour or so. But I think I'm going to just reduce it quite simply to say that freedom to me is to live your life to the best you can as you want to. And I think it's the ability to say yes, and it's the ability to say no. And we've already heard that, whether it's saying no to exploitative working practices, or saying yes because you want to travel from one country to another. And we'll come back to that later. And I think it's about the mix in your work life and your family life and your private life, and being able to make those decisions while accepting at the same time that there are restrictions, and sometimes society will put restrictions on you, sometimes government will put restrictions on you. We're all living under restrictions to our freedom at this current time. And as far as what could make the most difference for me, and I'll try and pick something that hasn't been said, and I'll say transparency and information. I think, for example, to migrant workers, transparency, knowing what's going to happen to you, where you're going to, and that being honest. And also, I think, to consumers, for example, and governments, and also employers, to know what's really happening. I mean, I've seen with one international company that make their senior managers, a food company, they have to go and walk the fields in Central America every year, once a year, and they are much more mature on the way they deal with these things because senior management actually sees people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. That's a very good point. Thank you for that. Next, we have Pins Brown, who is head of ethical and sustainable sourcing at The Body Shop, which was actually started by Anita Roddick in 1976 with the belief that business could be a force for good. So Pins, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you, as well as the one thing that you think could have the greatest impact on workers' freedom?
Hello, Cristina. Hello, everybody else who's dialed in from wherever you are around the world. So yeah, I'm called Pins. I'm the head of ethical and sustainable sourcing at The Body Shop. So that means my day job is I'm responsible for the ethics and sustainability of everything that The Body Shop buys and sells. Ginger shampoo, some of you may use. A foot file, very exciting, but I thought I'd bring it along. And like Steve, I'm going to be super short. I think there's two real answers to me in terms of what freedom means to me, voice and choice. And choice is more important, actually, because if I haven't got choice, I haven't got voice. So it echoes what everyone else has said. It's the choice to have what I want to do when I want to do it, to have meaningful control over my own life, basically. And I think apart from you, Cristina, I'm the first woman speaker. So to me, that includes control over my own body, access to contraception, you know, healthcare is I think typically more important to women who have more direct kind of reproductive lives. So that's also part of the situation that I think we live in, and that affects us directly as women throughout our lives. So that's really important to me. I asked my 11-year-old daughter, because she came in just before I was due to talk, and I said, what do you think freedom means, Ava, to you? And she said, not being trapped. And I thought, there we are. It's that, you know, not being stuck, as we've said about mobility, and that, in my sense, I think I have a very direct activity in my life, which is to save up 6 months worth of my living costs. So that to me means freedom in my day-to-day life. If I wish to walk away from my job, that I've got the freedom to do so. If my job disappears because of COVID, then I've built up a bit of space in my life. So financial independence is really important in that. And then the choice to define myself within, as Steve said, some of the restrictions that are necessary in a society, but otherwise to have, yeah, freedom of movement, freedom to wear what I want, dress, those types of freedoms. The greatest impact for workers, what do I think would make the greatest difference in terms of freedom for workers? I think that's partly in all of our minds. So I think the thing we need to do is look at the deep structures that we just accept around us. We have a kind of collective blindness, collective deafness. And I think the way as humans we end up exploiting other people, and again, this speaks to what Derba was saying, walking through the field. How is it that we think something is acceptable for us? You know, we want a certain standard of living, the right to a pension, the right to an abortion, the right to all of those things, a fair salary, wages, and yet somehow it's okay to work and live side by side with other people who don't. And yet we live like that all the time. We live side by side with other people who don't have the same access to the same basics. And I think we need to move our mindset and recognize what is work and why do we think that exploitation in those scenarios is possible, and ask ourselves why as human beings we do that, and stop discriminating, stop thinking of other human beings as somehow less. And I think we see that typically in agricultural commodities that have historically had slavery, but we see it right now in food supply chains, in our case in mica supply chains, all those areas. So I think we have to move our minds to recognize a common humanity and ask, how do we end up doing that to each other, and start thinking differently.
Okay, thank you very much, Prince, for that presentation. Thank you for that. Next, we have Rosie Hurst, who founded Impact in 1997, and it's an ethical trade organization that it specializes in improving labor conditions and raising productivity so that it benefits businesses and workers alike. So, Rosie, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you, as well as what you think could have the greatest impact in ensuring freedom for workers?
Yes, I mean, such a lot of great things have been said already, but what can I add to that? So our work at Impact is all about trying to balance it up, to make what works for workers work for business, and to tackle some of the underlying things that Cristina was just talking about. So what is freedom? Freedom, I think, is very much linked. We have to think of individual freedoms, but we also have to think about societal freedoms as well. There seems to be something in humanity that means that we actively enjoy exploiting other people. It happens so often and so regularly around the world that the things that Derba was talking about, which is the absence of choice, become the experience of so many millions of workers around the world. So what freedom means to me is giving back that choice. But in order to do that, in order to give back that choice, we have to rehumanize each other in our eyes. Because as Pins was saying, at the moment, it seems fine for some groups in society to exploit other groups of society. There are huge blind spots on this, enormous sector-wide, national-wide blind spots, which mean that we can pass by on the other side of the road and not notice when these things are happening. So for me, what needs to change is humanization. We need to look into the eyes of those who have less freedom than we do and ensure that that stops happening. Because once one rehumanizes, once one is able to get that rehumanization going, it becomes much more difficult for exploitation to thrive. That was all I was going to say, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Thank you for that presentation. I can see you and Pins are in agreement on that point. Next, we have David Camp, who's developed several programs focusing on improving human rights and recruitment practices in supply chains. So he is Chief Executive of the Association of Labour Providers. So it'd be interesting to see what you think, David. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you, as well as the one thing that you think could have the greatest impact on freedom for workers?
Yes, thank you, Cristina, and thanks for inviting me to share some thoughts. And it's always tricky coming down the agenda, not to say what everyone else has said, particularly when it's put so eloquently. So I've run an organisation called Alliance HR for a number of years. We do a variety of things. We run a trade association, the Association of Labour Providers, to drive responsible recruitment practices. We have a responsible recruitment toolkit that supports adoption of those practices. We have a programme called Stronger Together to support businesses to address modern slavery, and a programme called Fast Forward, which is an alternative next generation audit and improvement programme. So what's freedom? Well, for me, throughout my life, and I think this probably extends to everyone, it's control. It's control and choice to make the decisions that I want to make, and those there are some right decisions and there are some wrong decisions, but it's the ability and power to think, believe, love, be, speak, act as I want, obviously respecting others and within reasonable societal norms. Freedom and slavery are inextricably, and always have been inextricably, linked with money. Possession of money expands the available choices that you have. Conversely, want, desperation, cupidity, avarice are often drivers of exploitation and slavery. So I think it's very hard within our world today to disconnect freedom from money. What's the biggest change? I will pick one that hasn't been addressed so far. Perhaps it's idealistic. Well, it is idealistic, but it's a move from an extractive capitalist system to a responsible capitalist model. And what's the biggest thing that's going to precipitate that? I would say it's adoption of state legislation. Now, interestingly, today the government announced extension of Section 54 reporting to public bodies and introduction of mandatory reporting topics. But I think it's going to take pretty stringent legislation, state legislation, that compels business to conduct supply chain due diligence, together with civil penalties for victims where that has not been conducted. That type of legislation will drive change. Do I think it will happen? Well, gradually, I think, is my view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I just wanted to remind everybody, I could see some questions coming in from the audience. Please do feel free to write your questions to the right-hand tab, and we'll put those to the panelists a little bit later. Before that, I'm going to introduce Sam Ludlow-Taylor, who is the Ethical Trade Manager at the John Lewis Partnership, and she oversees the ethical supply chains at Waitrose. So the partnership is built on the principles of democracy and at its core, commercial success, as Derba mentioned, openness, fairness, and then everybody to a certain extent, but more so Steve, mentioned transparency. So Sam, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what freedom means to you, as well as what you think could have the greatest...
Hello, everyone.
Go.
Hi, sorry, I think I'm having there's a bit of a lag here. So hi, everyone, and thank you for listening to me today. I'm Sam Ludlow-Taylor, the Ethical Trade Manager at, principally looking after Waitrose, but I work for the whole of the John Lewis Partnership. So the answer to the two questions, what is freedom to me? Freedom to me is about choice, and by contrast, not really having a choice means that you're not free. So for me, if your two options are to stay somewhere and then be exploited there, or to take a perilous journey elsewhere and be exploited elsewhere, that's not somebody who has any freedom. Working within supply chains, we consider freedoms of people within their workplace. So whether you're free to choose to take a job or not, whether you're free to leave, whether you're free to join a trade union or not, whether you're free to join a union of your choice, whether you're free to be able to improve your working conditions through promotion, through training, and really being able to have that choice to an ability to develop yourself. At the partnership, we place a great importance on freedom. We are co-owners in the business, and we all have a say in how the business is run. And we want to mirror this down our supply chain. So working with our suppliers, we have a constitution in place to ensure that we are working fairly with the suppliers so that they can then pass down freedoms down the supply chain. And then I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the current situation. So, we're sat here on a webinar, which is because we can't all get together because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And many parts of the world at the moment are in some kind of lockdown or another. This morning, as I was thinking about this, we were waiting for further restrictions to come in place. And I think, there's been the announcement today, but actually, is that going to be it? Or is there going to be more announcements later on in the week? And I just wonder if this has actually given us more or less sympathy to those who aren't really free. I mean, on the one hand, I think the pandemic has given us all a taste of what having freedom curbed might feel like. We all may have some type of empathy with those who have a bit of a lack of choice, or there's a fear of a loved one getting ill, and maybe that's given us an ability to partially understand how somebody might feel to be forced to do something. But is there anything really compared with being forced to do something because your family is under threat? And on the other hand, I think, are we actually thinking any more about the freedoms of others? Are we really thinking about the impacts that our decisions have on other people? So within a supply chain situation, are we really thinking about those who are working further down the supply chain as we are going out and buying hand sanitizer and masks and rubber gloves and things like that? And I think there is a bit of a mix, but when we're out of the other side, I guess I have real hope that maybe this period will have taught us something about why we should be really all thinking about other people's freedoms. And what do I think would make the biggest difference? I think all of us need to take responsibility for our own decisions, for our own actions. Every single one of us have a role to play within this, to ensure that people within supply chains are enabled to have their own freedoms. And I think empathy is really, really important. So yeah, I think that would be my biggest difference, would be everyone taking responsibility for their actions.
Thank you very much, Sam. Okay, and now we come to our final panelist. So we had quite a lineup. This is Hannah Davis, who helps to run Farmer Voice Radio on behalf of the Lorna Young Foundation. So it's a charity that was set up in memory of an ethical trade pioneer that fought to get fair trade products, because we've been talking about commercial pressures into the mainstream retailers. So Farmer Voice Radio gives a voice to some of the world's poorest smallholders. Hannah, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us what freedom means to you and what you think would have the greatest impact on freedom for workers.
Thanks, Cristina. Thank you very much for inviting me to join the panel today. It's a pleasure being among such a great group of people and having the opportunity to discuss these challenging issues. So, as Cristina said, I manage Farmers Voice Radio, which is a participatory radio methodology that aims to improve access to information and knowledge for smallholder farmers. And my background is mainly working with smallholder farmers. I've previously managed programs with cocoa farmers in West Africa. And so I guess I'm coming at this question more from the perspective of smallholder farmers rather than workers. So I suppose in some senses they're self-employed, which theoretically means they might have more freedom to dictate their own working conditions and their living conditions, but in practice that's not necessarily true, due to a lot of the issues that have been raised by the other panelists today around power dynamics and transparency and so forth. And so, like so many people have said, I completely agree that freedom is really about choice. It's about the ability to decide on a particular course of action rather than being forced to do something or simply not have any other options. And choice is obviously influenced by a number of different factors, but the one thing that I want to focus on that I think would make a difference from the perspective of smallholders is about the particular role of information and knowledge, and having good access to information and knowledge. So I'm going to cheat here and break one thing down into three things. So for me, there are three aspects to this. So there's about having access to the right information at the right time in a format and via a medium that's relevant and appropriate. So many smallholder farmers are excluded from information sources because of poor infrastructure or physical and social remoteness, gender inequalities, low levels of education and literacy, time poverty, and so forth. And so finding a mechanism that can facilitate the sharing of information effectively and affordably at scale, I think would help in terms of supporting that ability to choose. Secondly, and somebody mentioned earlier about transparency, I think there's a question about democratizing knowledge. So knowledge is often controlled by people in a position of power. So too often in international supply chains, there's insufficient transparency and a communication amongst the people involved in those chains, the actors involved. And so a lot of the information about markets or standards or pricing that would really benefit smallholder suppliers, help to improve their production and their livelihoods, doesn't reach them. So tackling those power dynamics around control of information is important. And finally, and I think this speaks to what a few people have talked to about empathy and understanding from workers and smallholders from different perspectives, and I suppose rehumanizing this is valuing and promoting Indigenous knowledge. So smallholder farmers have centuries and centuries of experience of growing crops, and so valuing that and designing information on interventions or actions based on that perspective rather than what we, standing from this perspective, think is best is important. So we need more and better platforms for smallholders to have a voice, to provide their perspective and to help us to understand what things look like from where they're standing. So I think all of this together, this better information delivered in a better way, and with a fairer level of control, can help to support improved decision making for better outcomes for everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, for your presentation. Can I have all of the panelists on the same page? Is it possible to have that, or is it complicated? Oh, here we go. It's only Alfonso there. Here we go. I can, oh, here we go. So anybody else? Let me see. It's quite a group. Right. Okay. I think my first question is going to go to Derba again. So, Derba, I'm gonna kick off with you, just because it's coming through the questions, but also it was something that we had for the panelists. How much do you think freedom is about money? Do you think it's to do with money? How relevant is money? Because David Camp mentioned it earlier, and it just nudged me. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can't hear you, Deborah. Claire, can you make sure that he's not muted, please?
Okay, thank you,
We can.
Cristina. Thank you. Actually, money also. Can you hear me?
It's a slight lag, but go ahead. See if it catches up with.
So money also relevant for freedom. Actually, normally people who haven't money, who have a financial crisis with their family, who have responsibility for their family.
It's connection's a bit poor, Durba.
Okay, so they have to go to overseas for
It's just the timeline is.
what?
Can we don't worry, Durba, it's fine. It's fine. It's just technology.
Because due to financial crisis,
I'm going to try to pass it. I'm going to try to pass it on. If you can write, if you can write the answer.
Is financial.
Oh yeah.
They have to go to the overseas for work.
Right.
So it's
write the answer to me, and I will try to read it out. I'm going to.
Very difficult for them because of money. They have to go to the overseas and have to accept whatever in having in their life.
Okay.
Because of their financial problem.
We can't hear.
Unemployment.
Oh, it's so frustrating. He's writing that he's also got a lot of rain and thunder over at the other end, so the connection is actually terrible. So he can't get it through. If we can, Claire, if you can send him a message to write us an answer. I've tried twice, but he might not be able to see it. We can read it out for him. Okay. Rosie, do you want to take that question?
Yes, happily.
Very sorry.
Yeah, how important is money? I mean, we have been interviewing, actually working with Durba and others. We probably interviewed 6,000 migrants this year. People coming into the Gulf or going into Malaysia. And for all of them, money has been very, very high up the list. It's not that money is freedom, but it is without money, freedom is impossible. And as Durba was saying, people are not free at home. They make the difficult choice, for it is a choice, to go overseas. It's not what they thought. And again, the streets are not paved with gold. We did some maths actually yesterday looking at how long it takes a migrant, for example, from Bangladesh to repay a recruitment fee. And we found that after 7 years in Malaysia, a Bangladeshi person was able to pay off the recruitment fee earn enough money to start a very, very small business, which would get them a very tiny income at home. So the repayment of recruitment fees is incredibly important when we're looking at the kind of migrant worker avenues that we see into Malaysia and into the Gulf and into Singapore, because that money is the lack of money, and that debt bond is the thing that keeps workers having to say yes to things they don't want to do. And as Durba said, that can be yes to overtime, it can be yes to sexual advances, it can be yes to living in degrading circumstances, but it's that lack of freedom, that lack of ability to pay, to say no, is very, very largely determined by debt bondage and lack of money. So it's not everything, but if you can, I mean, what we found is that if you get the recruitment fees paid back promptly and in full, then what happens is workers' sense of respect goes up, and then therefore their ability to say yes or no also goes up. It's not a panacea, it's not a cure-all, and there's a lot to be done with the rehumanisation and the improvement of social relations in the workplace and in broader society. But money, you know, as they say, behind every great fortune is a great crime. And I think the great crime we're looking here, beneath the great fortunes of the West and the great fortunes of the stock market, one of the great crimes is the trafficking in persons, whether technically trafficking or not, which is the work these migrants do at the bottom of our supply chain. A long answer, hopefully. I'm sure Durba would have said it better.
I think he's actually written, we've got his answer. Thank you, Durba. So Durba is saying that definitely money steals migrants' freedom, as once we take a loan to pay for recruitment fees, we have to work, otherwise we lose our house and our land. So it's the indebtedness, the debt that they carry once they go into the recruitment process that has a massive impact. I think this would lead me really to David Camp as on the next question, just leading on from that. So you know, we know that migrant workers the world over, even in the UK, in many cases need to use labour agencies, whether they're formal or informal, when there is a need there to access employment and opportunity. What needs to change then if we're using?
What needs to change? Huge amounts. So I'm going to start with positivity. I know a number on this webinar have done some good work in getting recruitment fees repaid, but and what else is positive? I think in the last few years, a growing awareness of the need to address practices in recruitment. I've been working in this space for quite some years now, but I guess it's in the last 3 or 4 years that we've seen a real awakening to the fact that probably the single business practice that puts most people into a forced labour situation, a debt bondage situation, is through the recruitment process. So there has been an increasing awareness, but what needs to happen? I'm going to just go through the spectrum. There needs to be legislation in countries that effectively bans the charging of recruitment fees. We've seen various compacts, we've seen various agreements between governments, but we haven't seen this translated into legislation yet. So that's the first thing. We moved forward with the ILO definition of recruitment fees last year, which was positive, but we've not seen that wide-scale adoption by states and supply chains as yet, and certainly I've been involved in arguments with different groups around this fact. So legislation, investor focus, investors driving responsible recruitment, investors driving focus on this in the practices that businesses undertake. I would add responsible recruitment and elimination of recruitment fees as an extra, as the 10th ETI base code, and incorporation within other global labour standards, so that it becomes incorporated within audit methodologies globally. I would support trade associations throughout the world that support recruitment agencies that create responsible recruitment corridors, that identify those agencies that are doing it properly, that there is a legitimate way in which labour providers and recruiters can operate without being priced out of the market by those who charge astonishing and totally unacceptable fees for workers. That's enough for now. I could go on, but I think that's probably enough on that answer. So huge, you know, we started. Have we started? Yeah. We just about started. Yeah, but we've got a huge way to go.
I mean, I think for me, it would be interesting to hear from Alfonso, because Alfonso, you have to manage about 10,000 workers in the global supply chains. Is it all about the recruitment agencies? What works? What actually works? How are you addressing this, and what are the risks?
Well, it's not just about recruitment agencies or employment agencies, but you know, I agree with David. It's one of the main factors. It's one of the main players in the game that, you know, might affect in a positive way or in a negative way, whether you see cases of labor exploitation or lack of freedom. The problem, I can mostly speak about the food industry, the agricultural industries, where I have spent you know, the last 6 years of my career. One of the trends that you can see in that industry is that normally, in most cases, you see a very little percentage of national workers in that industry. So that means that, you know, international migration is an essential part of the story, and that obviously that represents itself a huge challenge, because you have to deal with, you know, international flows of workers. It's hard to track the recruitment journey. You see, you know, now the recruitment challenges are getting extremely complex, and on the other hand, even small farm holders here in Europe have a very simple access to complex recruitment channels. So it's very surprising how a small farm in Lincolnshire can, with, you know, three workers throughout the year, but, you know, 20 workers during the season, can have an access to a very complex international Eastern recruitment channel. It's kind of fascinating the way the recruitment industry has kind of eased the process to reach many corners in Europe. So that, okay. Yeah, that represents a huge challenge. Also, labor regulations, as you know, David also mentioned that already. It's a tremendous challenge, because, you know, we operate globally. You know, at Cheese Fresh and all businesses, we have, you know, subsidiaries, supply chains everywhere, and you have your values, your code of conduct, your requirements, your standards, but then you have to deal with the actual context, and sometimes the context doesn't help. That's a reality, and you see, you know, vague labor framework like in the UK that, you know, leaves too much room for employers to actually have a say on many working conditions, or extreme fixed labor frameworks like in Eastern Europe that generate a massive gap between the reality of the industry and the labor conditions to some other labor framework that perhaps works much better, or there's more room for collective bargaining agreements. So that's something that all businesses have to deal with and can determine whether you can successfully manage your modest labor risk or not.
Okay, so I'm going to thank you very much. I'm gonna head over to Steve. Steve, you were very brief in your introduction, but you've worked with governments and international organizations around the world. I suppose I have two questions for you. First of all, are we looking at migration with the right lens? And secondly, is it government that's the guarantor of freedom? I mean, who controls this at the end? How can we really improve this?
I think it's a really important question. I think that I probably wasn't the only person who, at the start of sort of lockdowns, ended up listening, reading John Locke, and I recommend everybody to go back to John Locke, not just because it works on lockdown, but to actually think about what the conception of a state is and why societies over centuries have constructed political states to do things. Because one thing we've seen over the last 6 months is obviously the role of the state and the potential power of the state is immense. And I think it's time that we started thinking about both what the role is and how to harness that, because and David's already mentioned it, and I think Alfonso, you just mentioned it, is that you look all over the world and you see issues around core freedoms and the guarantee of freedoms, and it's the state that is the central thing that fails. We can talk about businesses and the role of businesses, and we can talk about supply chains, but if the state isn't delivering, or the state is obfuscating, or the state is, using, and I'll use the United States as an example, concepts of freedom to essentially undermine freedom, and say that there is no collective solidarity, there is total freedom. So actually the reality is very few people get freedoms unless you've got money. I think this is a really important thing to look at, and I think certainly a lesson for us, and Rosie has been working in this environment as well over the last couple of years, but the work we've been doing in the last year with FIFA and the ILO in Qatar, where there has been, positive steps, but everybody was waiting until a couple of weeks ago for one actor to move. You had, you had the ILO, you had FIFA, you had the International Trade Union Movement, you had Human Rights Watch focusing on issues of freedom of workers, but without the Qatari state changing its legislation, nothing could happen. So I think we should put, front and center again, the state and the state's role, because there is one thing that is very clear, I think, from COVID-19, and that's that states have become more important, and also, and I think this is dangerous in lots of ways, hard borders have become important again. I think a year ago in Europe, let's leave Brexit aside for one moment, we can come back to it, but is that if we had said there would be hard borders imposed, albeit temporarily, between Germany and France and the Netherlands and Germany, we've said that's impossible. That can never happen. It happened, right? And we already know, as far as being able to move as a migrant worker, and migrant workers have been stranded all over the world because of governments closing down hard borders. We're in a very, very dangerous situation at the moment. But like I said, if we take our eye off governments, both we take our eye off the potential biggest risk to freedom, but also we take our eye off the biggest guarantor of freedom as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see you'd like to make a comment on this. Over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of put some of those points together. Like, if the state is the most important actor, and if COVID-19 has reminded us of that, which I wholly agree, then what can the businesses, one of which I represent as well as myself today, what can businesses do then? And I think this is an example of when you said, what needs to change, Cristina, but also what has changed. And when I listen to all of us, and we're in a scenario of sort of doom and gloom, except Steve, who I know is an optimist, and I'm not saying the rest of the panel, including Durba, who talking about freedom of religion and other things, is so much has changed for the better for so many people. You know, I'm 46, like Cristina, my mother was a migrant worker, is now 79, you know, completely different life from mine. Left, you know, many things have changed positively, and the narrative between business and the state, and business actually lobbying the state to do better for worker rights and freedom within supply chains is also changing. And if I'm thinking, you know, for those who are listening to this webinar in Europe and other continents, what does that practically mean? For me in my job and my team most recently, if I just pick 2 examples, that's been the call regarding the EU about mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence that we know that I'm proud to say the Body Shop signed up to. Thank you for anti-slavery and the ETI for asking us to sign the letter. But, you know, important for us to put out a call along with food industry companies for that to be something as businesses we all ought to do, so that we know what the problems are and what we can do about them. So that narrative has shifted dramatically for businesses to be lobbying the state to do better, right? That's a huge shift, and goes back to things like Morecambe Bay with ETI and seeing migrant workers who are at the bottom of those supply chains, completely informal workers. So that's the second point I want to pick up about where can business lobby the state to expand who's formal and who's not, whose work is who's not work. We know examples. I'm sorry, I could get echo. I'm sorry, I could turn myself down. Not my forte.
We can hear you though,
lobbying the state to have amnesties for migrant workers, undocumented workers, to get them documented, which of course historically has happened in the state, and then make sure we look after them. And those are legacies of slavery, is when you emancipate people or they emancipate themselves, to make sure they've then got the financial means to earn a living. So that's crucial. And I was thinking back to the shampoo bottle in our case, you know, workers in Bangalore in India collecting waste and them getting, I haven't got one in my mind, but you all know who've worked on home workers, state recognition. You know, in the UK, that would be a social security card. But we know from the waste picker workers, predominantly women, not only women, getting that card that says, I am a worker. Beforehand, I was collecting waste, but I was being harassed by the police. The municipal authorities don't value my work. So getting business to lobby the state about whose work is even work, right? And in households, whose work is work, you know, women's, all of those things. So I think this connection between the state's power to provide recognition to workers, to provide amnesty for migrant workers, all of that, there's lots that business can do to get the state to use its power for good rather than to repress.
Okay.
Sorry, so that's my tuppence worth.
Thank you very much.
Worth, probably.
I've got 2 people that I want to lead on to, but Nick was pushing hard. Nick, the question to you really, Sam, you're next. You're definitely next because this links to what Prince has just said. Nick, do you think there is the political will to do better? Can't hear. Okay.
I would like to think there is political will, but I think we have to dream a little bit because we live in a very imperfect world here. But thanks, Pins, because you really raised the point I wanted to make. But whilst I absolutely embrace what's being said by Steve and others about the need for top-down action, my sort of worldview is very much that we need to have a meeting of top-down and bottom-up responses to these challenges. And so I would just blow the whistle for worker organisation and representation. Workers on their own stand vulnerable and disempowered, voiceless, really. And it is only when workers can come together that they are in a position to be able to balance up a voice of their own with the very strong voices of business and the state coming down from the top. So I think as part of the formula to bring a solution, you have to have a bottom-up organised labour component. Thanks.
Okay, I'm coming to Deborah again, sorry, but Sam first. Sam, earlier on in the year, we saw a call by the retailers, going back to Pin's point, we saw a call by the retailers to potentially stop dealing with Brazil if they didn't address the deforestation issue. So there was the whole thing about we're going to rip the Amazon apart, we're going to plant whatever we want to plant, and the retailers got together, and this is the first time that I've seen it in a very long time, wrote a letter saying, you know, we won't be able to buy from you. Do you see this as the next step for businesses in terms of pressuring governments and trying to address labor and human rights issues? It's effectively could be a lobby, a boycott, couldn't it? Is this one way to pressure? Is this a good thing to do? Did it have a positive impact?
So I think I'd start by saying that, you know, boycotting can be a very powerful political move when it's done. It can have a great impact on a country's ability to trade. I think we started to see smaller boycotts as well over the last couple of years, kind of at a consumer level. And I think, you know, if you've got a well-defined list of asks, then it can be quite effective if you've got the carrot and the stick. But I think we also need to really think about this word boycott and think about the ethics of, if we're looking on a smaller scale, would you pull out of a supplier who's breached a code? Would that be an ethical way to behave? And therefore, at country level, is it ethical then just to pull the plug on somebody? So is that actually the right thing that we should be doing, or should we be trying to work with people and bring them along that journey? Should we be? It's more of an advocacy piece. And I think the other question that we need to ask ourselves is who's going to ultimately suffer, because workers. At the end of the day, the risk with a boycott at country level is that all that happens is that then you are impacting on the people that are working within that country, and they are the ones that are likely then to end up coming out of this the worst. And I think just think about the example specifically from Brazil. It's quite interesting the way that was picked up by the media. I think the word boycott was not something that letter was ever meant to do, but what it was meant to do was to really kind of lay out very clearly that if businesses have very strong policies in place, such as ourselves, so we have very, very strong policies on soya and on deforestation. Cristina, you're looking really tense. Is this because you can't hear me?
No, I can hear you. It's fine.
Okay.
I'll tell you
Or have I got the answer wrong?
I've just seen questions come up.
But you know, we have very strong policies in place when it comes to
poker face. Sorry.
When it comes to things like soy, when it comes to deforestation, and actually that letter was designed to explain that, you know, if you continue to go down this path that you are currently looking at, looking at our own business practices and what we hold ourselves to account to, will actually be unable to purchase from you, because we are then fundamentally going against what our policies are. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about boycott. I think maybe you're kind of coming out at the same end, but actually it's about that way that you are going about it. It's that engagement process. It's that holding, and again, it kind of comes back to my first point about everyone needs to hold themselves to account. We need to hold ourselves to account as a business to policies that we have set ourselves. Yeah. If we then continue to do trade in an area where we know that somebody is not complying with those policies, is it a boycott, or are we just holding ourselves to account? I think we're probably more on the holding ourselves to account side.
That leads us to Rosie. Rosie, what would you like to say about this?
Yeah, I think it's my whole career, I've thought that boycotts were not effective, but I've had radically to change that view over the last few months, particularly looking at rubber glove supply chains from Malaysia, which of course have been the subject of a very targeted boycott by the US government. Now, it's curious to find myself so closely aligned with the US government, particularly with the Department for Customs and Border Protection, which is the body, it's part of the Department of Homeland Security, and obviously has all kinds of different activities, for example, on the southern border of the United States, which seem very far from ethical. But this particular part of their work has been to boycott specific companies when they believe there is forced labor in those companies, and not to allow those companies access to the United States market for a period of time until they can demonstrate that they have taken steps to prevent the goods they're making being made under forced labour. And what's quite interesting about this is it's not a mass balance system. It is directly about specific products from a specific place. And what we have found, actually working with a couple of companies who've been sanctioned in this way, is a tremendous volte-face. So from using the kind of practices which Deborah was describing, in particular the financial side of heavy recruitment fees and forced overtime and all of that, turning around very, very rapidly and repaying really significant amounts of money to workers in quite short order. Now, obviously, this is hugely labour intensive, and you can't go about sanctioning each business that is doing these practices. The business is given a chance not to be sanctioned. This is for people who won't respond. But what I think we're hoping is that in some sectors there might be a domino effect, because the choke chain of not being able to import into the United States is a really significant thing. So it means that companies are losing $50 million a day, that kind of number. So almost any reimbursement, almost any remediation is actually quite cheap in comparison to that. And I think it's having a tremendously levelling effect. So definitely strange bedfellows and a strange volte-face for me to thinking actually these very, very targeted specific boycotts can be a very good thing.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one last question for Hannah, and I'm going to come back to the worker voice aspect. So before I open it up to the panels, because I'm getting lots of questions here to the right of me. So so with the Lorna Young Foundation, you're working with quite vulnerable and very remote rural communities in Africa, and you give farmers a voice on the radio. So I've seen the program work in the DRC, in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, with PINS, in Uganda, and some farmers, some workers are facing droughts. There's failing crops, there's hunger due to climate change. There is going to be more migration. I have no doubt about it. What do you think that those radio programs are achieving in terms of when it comes to freedom as well?
Thanks for the question, Chris. So I think, again, it's really about supporting informed decision making and facilitating some kind of action and freedom in the face of those challenges. So to give a concrete example, we've been working on a project in central Uganda with the Walker Institute, so a research institute on climate change in the district of Katakwi, which is very flood prone, and a lot of the farmers are in the situation of losing 100% of their crops almost every year as a result of flooding, and they don't have the freedom to move somewhere else because, you know, when it comes down to it, there aren't really any other options. There's nowhere else to go. Their families are there. They can't just up sticks, and they don't own any lands anywhere else. And so they have to learn to live with the situation that's facing them. They have their own warning systems. So, you know, then it's not that they're not aware that the seasons are changing, that there's more extreme weather. You know, they're noticing the changing patterns of migratory birds, the kind of untimely appearance of certain pests and diseases, but they don't necessarily, because they don't have access to the kind of information sources that we have, they don't necessarily understand why this is happening or how they can change their behavior, their farming in the face of that. And so what the radio programs are doing are kind of delivering accurate but very localized and very timely information in very local languages in a way that people are able to understand on practices that can be delivered using local resources, so perhaps less dependent on kind of more sophisticated equipment or tools. And so, you know, we're seeing examples of people switching to things like upland rice production or improving their cattle shelters, creating rainfall capture systems out of local materials, that kind of thing. But even more importantly, potentially, is the platform, because the way that the radio programs are generated is it's through discussion groups where farmers are they create their own content for the radio programs. It's not an anonymous expert sitting in a radio studio talking about very generic actions that should be taken. It's actually farmers sharing their own experience of what works in their particular context. And because this is a very wide broadcast medium that anybody can listen to, acts as a dialogue or an information exchange platform. And so talking about the role of states at a very local level, you have local government listening to those radio stations and getting a clearer picture of what people in those very remote, vulnerable communities are experiencing, where they may not usually have that access to their perspective. And so we've seen examples of then the district government being able to lobby the central government to access resources for investments in valley dams to prevent flooding, or tractors to support people in that situation. And so I think the programs give people a sense of freedom to have their voices heard and to claim their rights, I suppose, in a situation where they're facing perhaps larger pressures like climate change that are beyond their control.
Mm-hmm. I quite like the DRC programs. The women took control of the radio and turned it into something completely different. They talked about violence, political rights, human rights. It was a radio program that was set up to address crops and cocoa and agroforestry, and they turned it into something completely different because they were going through terrible times in the DRC. So very powerful.
And absolutely, that's people's right. I think, the wonderful nature, but perhaps risk of participatory approaches like that is, people have the right to say what they want. And so you think you're doing a program about agriculture, and suddenly it's about women's rights, and it's about combating gender violence, which is fantastic. It's giving people a sense of control that they haven't had before.
They took ownership of it. Okay. Right, I'm going to open it up. So we left it a little bit with the boycott question before we got to the radio, worker voice, and giving people a voice. Alfonso, commercial pressures, trading pressures, how would that work with you, and perhaps Pins as well to a certain extent with the Body Shop? What would happen if there was collective action against a company or a country or around a labour and human rights issue? What would happen? How seriously would you take it? I'm thinking of specific countries in Europe. I'm not thinking of Latin America or Africa, but how effective would it be? Would it make you rethink your strategies?
Well, I mean, you mean commercial pressure? Okay. As a business, putting commercial pressure in our supply base, just to get. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's something. Yeah. Obviously, we are as suppliers. We would be. We'll have to perhaps rethink the whole. The way the business is built, and we have the power to actually, work with our subsidiaries. So, as a business, and perhaps it's one of the things that makes this slightly different. We have quite a big farming business with a small supply chain, external supply chain. So as a farming business, we have the ability to drive change in our operations. So if there is any case of labor exploitation or an international move against one of the countries where we operate as a business, that obviously for us will represent a major challenge as a business. Just following building on the debate we've had, I do agree that those pressures work. I think that, but you need to be very careful with the side effects. I think that's being also said, because you might be punishing the wrong people, or the wrong player, or perhaps creating something, a side effect that might last more than you expect. So, the context matters, has also been said. So you need to be very careful with all those actions. And yeah, but just trying to expand the idea of commercial pressures a little bit, just trying to expand the debate. Other pressures that affect businesses is the commercial, the commercial pressures that we see from importers, from some of our customers, the way those pressures drive prices down, and the way that affects your capacity or your resources to actually tackle labor exploitation. So that's something that, as perhaps this is me working as a true supplier, and that's perhaps one of the big elephants in the room that we see in those debates, that we are trying to to fight very complex issues, and those issues require resources, and that's the reality. So you can ignore it, but that's the reality. And sometimes you can deal with the issue in many different ways. You can try to simplify your organizational model. That will cost you more because it will increase your labor costs. You can, have as I said, a complex international recruitment stream that is more efficient because it works very well for you because you only have the right people when you need. But to manage that, you will need also resources. So perhaps this is again me inviting the rest of the panel to expand the debate to think, what's the impact of those other commercial pressures and financial pressures that we see throughout the supply chains.
And do you want to? We can't. Have you been switched off? No, we still can't hear you. I think so. Go. No. We still can't hear you. Claire. The magic person in the background. Can you switch her on?
Right, can you hear me yet?
Yes.
Ay, caramba. Okay, I'm just checking I understood the question. You mean if there was a boycott against the Body Shop, what would be the impact? Or the commercial pressures in the business?
Boycott in a country where you source products, what would you do? I mean,
a boycott of our products, or I'm confused.
Country, even if you wanted to, would you ever think about boycott? I know it's perhaps a very difficult question for you to answer, but what would happen if there was labor and human rights abuses on a mass scale, and I think
I challenge the question. I mean, we sell in 71 countries, so okay. Are there labor and human rights abuses in the countries that we sell and source from? Yes, of course there are, from top to bottom. So it's not a possibility. I mean, it's a definite scenario, right? We have done a human rights and environmental due diligence exercise. This means Steve knows all our secrets, where we're doing well, where we're not, and it's our job to go away and get on with them. I mean, the Body Shop is owned by a Brazilian company, Natura, not known to most of you unless you were in Latin America, but a big presence in Latin America. And do we know that we have issues throughout? Absolutely. So it's our job to say, okay, we have low wages here. We have, I don't know, migrant workers who are having their passports retained here, or we don't know what's going here, or here I can see photographs of a mine and there is no guide rail up the ladder. Forget passport retention. That's like a possible problem. I don't mean we should forget it. I simply mean the guide rail on the ladder where someone's going to break their back tomorrow. That's sort of the priority. And we have tried to be, I think Steve's point about transparency, we've tried to be very upfront. I have our modern slavery statement printed. Here it is. This is what we did in 2019, which lists the good, the bad, and the ugly. Literally, in that sense, where have we made progress on promoting decent work, and where have we really got work to do on dignity, equity, etc. But I think the piece about migration and freedom of movement is so central to workers' rights. And I said to you, Cristina, in the private chat, if I'm Durba, whether he can hear me or not, and I've made a decision to go or if it's your parents who came from where they came from to the UK, or Steve's grandparents who came from Ireland, I could be wrong, Steve, but there was someone not so far back. No, okay, completely wrong. But people migrate for good reason, which is they've got pull factors to another place, and they've got push factors from their own place, and they can maybe earn 3 times as much somewhere else. And so I think on the commercial pressures, we're also looking about what work are we providing, directly or indirectly, and what money is in the system. And we can challenge the narrative of commercial pressure by saying, well, hang on, who's paid how much at the top and the middle? Yeah, we're not transparent on that. I'm not saying we are, but will there be a move in that direction? And can we challenge that narrative internally? Absolutely. And that's like, you know, Amartya Sen on development and freedom and the Bengal famine. Why was there a famine? Not because there wasn't enough food, because the food wasn't distributed properly. So I think the point about distribution, how we distribute money, how we distribute time, how we argue people's access to justice and to better pay over time. We don't say it's in 10 years when we've solved everything. So for us, that, to me, those commercial questions all come together on challenging the narrative about where the money goes, to whom, for what, balanced with the opportunity to work and the fact that I know full well that there are people at the bottom not earning enough, and that money needs to go up, right? Wages need to go up. And the Body Shop is a B Corp, which means that in our memorandum and articles of association lodged in the UK in which we're headquartered, our legal statutes hold us to a triple bottom line. So we can argue that internally, we signed up to that internally. Our B Corp assessment is public reading for anyone who wants to go onto the B Corp website. So to me, those commercial pressures for us are shifting, and the global view is shifting because of the Brazilian ownership. We don't talk about South-South cooperation. We're owned by the South.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, Derba, if you can you hear me properly now? Can you hear me? If we ask you those questions, it keeps coming in and out. I don't know how good the connection is. So I'm going to ask you what Pins has just asked, which is why did you travel for work, and what were the push and pull factors? What were you thinking? We can't hear you. Do you want to write it? If you write it, I'll read it out, or we can read it out for you. Okay, and in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for a response, I would like to open up the questions to the people who've been sending me questions continuously for the last half hour. So, and you can volunteer to take them, but the first question was actually to Derba as well, which was, oof. The other question that somebody sent you, so many, sorry. What do you think people in the UK could do to support Nepalese workers' rights? Do you hear it? I'll write it to him as well. No, it's a bit difficult. Does anybody want to take? Does anybody have any ideas on that? Supporting Nepalese workers' rights? I'll write it to Derba to see if we get a response. Go on, Pins, tell me.
Well, we have a Nepalese paper manufacturer, part of our community fair trade supply chain. 30 years we've been buying from them. This is their nice paper. They're in Kathmandu, they're in lockdown, and that means it's tough. And what's interesting, talking of freedom, is hearing from them about the discrimination faced by workers returning from India and other places. So here we go back to the power of the state. So the state in Nepal has been partly distributing, you know, food and water and access to medicine. And of course, depending on where you are on the caste and migrant worker tree, you may or may not get access. So what can we do? I've asked our Nepalese supplier to try and talk to the Foreign Office, see whether that will make any difference, to use the means that we have as a British company. And we are listening to Milan, the manager of that supply company, of Get Paper Industries in Nepal, about changing our language to call it safe distancing and not social distancing, because that's exacerbating the discrimination that people who are either returning from other countries or who have had COVID have experienced. So I think that thing about understanding discrimination and lobbying to address it And historically, the Body Shop's purchasing of paper has been 5% of Nepalese UK trade, which I know is only 5%, but it's not bad for one company. So, you know, trying to use the power levers that we have because of the historic relationship between Britain and Nepal.
Okay,
Promoting them on Instagram, trying to get them more business from elsewhere, trying to lobby for women in Nepal who are often second-class citizens. So there's lots, but I'll shush.
Okay, no, but great. Nick Kitely, I have a question for you here. So the question was, globally, where are workers' rights most at risk? Follows on from what Clint was just saying, as a result of the COVID lockdown. Where do you think, from what you're seeing, or anybody else as well? Ooh. Nick, can't hear you. You need to switch on your microphone. You can't talk.
Now I can. Now I can. I think basically workers are at risk everywhere. It's down to their vulnerability. So you could find vulnerable workers probably in any part of the world. But the greater their vulnerability to start with, the higher their vulnerability now as a result of COVID, because what it has done is just exacerbate the vulnerability of the most vulnerable to start with. If you were a relatively well-off or middle-class person, then COVID may have been an inconvenience, but for most, there have been options and ways for you to survive and do okay. When you had nothing to start with and you were totally dependent on a thread of employment to keep you going, you've got very few options as to where you go or how you respond. So you become more vulnerable. Potentially you open yourself to fresh forms of exploitation because you will do anything to survive. And you will find those corners of the world everywhere.
Okay, Rosie,
of course. Can I just say, of course, again, as I said earlier, if only those workers are in some way organized so that they have the voice, the powerful voice of many, then there is an avenue of opportunity to strengthen where they are. If they have no organization, they're incredibly vulnerable.
Okay, so, hey, Rosie first, because she put her hand up first.
Yeah, I was just going to add a quick thing which actually plays to the commercial conversation that we were having earlier, which is what we're finding is that given the vulnerability, Nick, that you were talking about, if you layer on top of that industries which have become much less busy and industries which have become much more busy as a result of COVID. So in where there's less busyness, we're seeing people stranded, people high and dry, people who have got no real contract are in a worse condition, but even people with contracts, you know, if there's no money, there's no money. And if the oil isn't pumping into the engine, if petrol's not pumping into the engine breaks, and employment is no longer something that can get people out of poverty. We've been doing some work on direct cash transfers directly to workers deep in the supply chain, but you know, this is just, to speak vulgarly, pissing in the wind, to be honest. This problem is enormous, and I think it's only once the music stops that you realize just how much money there is tied up in the supply chain. So to cover the wages for workers in one factory for 1 month, a factory in Bangladesh is going to be £100,000. It's going to be far more than any little ethical trading budget that there's going to be. So we start to see this really significant disruption, which means there just isn't enough money in the system to keep people off the street. At the other end, we have those sectors which have become more busy. So that could be amongst delivery drivers in China, for example, who became extremely busy, makers of PPE in China, masks, in Malaysia, rubber gloves. And there, the opportunity for exploitation becomes much higher. So you have people who are forced to work 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, almost as a kind of national duty. There was one particularly nasty scheme, Heroes for COVID, which was workers working on Sundays on their off day for vouchers. And there was no sign that the products were going going to be given away in any way. They were part of the whole commercial thing. It was just a way of getting around overtime regulations. And of course, the people perhaps who are the most vulnerable are those who are stranded. So in the Gulf, we spent actually a few weeks ago, spent a lot of time talking to a group of workers who were between contracts in the Gulf, and they were basically utterly penniless. They couldn't leave because of COVID regulations, and they couldn't work because of COVID regulations. And all they were getting was rice 3 times a day. They didn't have twice a day, and they didn't even have money for soap. So when it comes down to it, something like the COVID epidemic, the music stops, the money stops flowing, and this world of work, which is the world which, say, you know, it's the engine of development. When the music stops there just isn't enough money to go round to everyone at the bottom of the supply chain, and governments are powerless to intervene. That leads one to believe perhaps the global supply chain is some sort of a Ponzi scheme, with money being recycled and there not being enough to go round. We have to ask real questions about the length of supply chains and the way that money is distributed down.
Mm-hmm. Steve, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think Rosie said many of the things that I was going to say, but I think one thing we've seen for some work that we've been doing for the World Bank to try and identify exactly those pockets of highest vulnerability and impact are also around conflict and women workers around conflict, because what we're seeing, and not only women workers but migrant workers also, situations where big infrastructure projects, which in large parts of the world they do drive change and they certainly bring real money in and take real money out, but is essentially militarization in some parts. We've been trying to get some workers out of northern Pakistan for some time now, migrant workers who are just stuck. And the military won't let them out, they won't let them go. Their home country won't let them come back because they feel that they may be stigmatized by infection. So we're seeing some absolutely awful situations, and I think the Gulf is bad, but actually there's some parts of Africa and around northern Pakistan, Afghanistan, and parts of India which I think are even worse.
Okay. I mean, it's pretty dire. I don't think we're going to be able to know just what the impact has been of this until the music stops, like you said, Rosie. I want to come back to Durba because he did write me some answers to my questions. So in answer to the question that was sent by the panelists earlier about what we could do in the UK, he's still here. He's just switched his video off because the electricity is not great over at the other end, so he can hear us. He said that UK customers should monitor and push employers to be honest with migrant workers. That would be effective. So we should continue to monitor and push for that to happen. And then in terms of the push and pull factors that led him to migrate for work, he says he traveled specifically for money and with a dream that he could earn something for himself and his family and improve their lives. So that's his answer. It's every migrant's dream, really, in a way, isn't it? It's how many migrants leave their home saying we'll come back one day, and they never actually do. Even some of them never come back. They stay out for years working, trying to realize that dream because it's so hard. But yeah, so that's Durba's answer. Let me come back to the next question that was sent. I have so many, I have to go up and down. That's on COVID. We had somebody ask, okay. We've got so many. So can anybody give me some real examples of good ones, please, of companies' actions or organizations that have taken specific actions to make changes that have increased the freedom of workers at the grassroots of supply chains? I mean, I know we've just been talking about COVID, but I mean, we've never been through a pandemic before. This is something that's very new to all of us. We're learning as we go along, I suspect, in many cases. But could anybody give me some actions of or initiatives that have worked to ensure freedom for workers at the root level? Sam, you've been so quiet. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be.
No, I was.
Got somebody else going.
I was just thinking actually about the work that we do through the Waitrose Foundation, because we have a supply chain program where we actually 2% of the retail value of the sales goes back into the supply chain. And it's all about kind of development, but giving people that, is empowering those working within the supply chains to be able to make those choices for themselves. So you are the workers themselves decide how they can spend that money. We kind of work on there's a needs assessment first of all, so you ensure that all of your basic needs are met, and then after that the funding is kind of split out. I think it's a really good example of how it's embedded within the business dealings, because it's all connected back to the trade that we're doing. The money is then put back in through the supply chains, and then it's so a lot of the work's done with supporting childcare so that women can get back into work, supporting women, women's programs so that they can improve their own economic empowerment and get into business. So yeah, I think that would probably be one of the examples that I would have. And I'm going to hand over to Pins, because I think she was waving her hands in the air, but she might have just been moving and it's my static internet.
It was Rosie.
It was Rosie.
Well, I think, yeah, it was Rosie and then David too.
Okay. Who wants to go first?
I'll just jump in very quickly. Yeah, I think we've seen some progress on direct remedy for forced labour. So this is remedy meaning actually for the people involved sorting it out, so the damage that has been done to them is mended in some way. Now, the damage that is done can be psychological, and it can be medical, and it can be social, and it can be all kinds of things, but it is very often financial. Because as Deborah was saying, the dream is to earn enough money to be able to have a better life back home, get your kids into school, all of that kind of thing. And we are seeing progress with large sums of money now being paid back to people, which should theoretically enable them at least to have a better choice next time round. So if they choose to migrate again, they'll be migrating from a net positive position, and they will also have been around the block a couple of times and been in a much better position to push back against exploitation. But these things are very, very small in number. I mean, I'm a great believer in thinking just one migrant whose life is made better, that is worth doing. And if you can make 1,000 people's lives better, or 10,000 people's lives better, that is still worth doing. But we just have to be very realistic that the pendulum has not swung. So whilst those individuals are having a better time, the vast majority of their brothers and sisters are not, and there is no evidence to show that future people coming behind them will have a better time. So we're in this position of, in a way, continually closing the stable door after the first voltage, and that's what needs to change.
Okay, thank you. David, would you like to say something?
Yes, there we go. Well, I guess just a few words on the work that we've done over the last few years, and an unashamed plug towards the free resources and guidance that there is available. So we've, over the last few years, put thousands and thousands of businesses through training in spotting the signs and understanding the risks of infiltration into their business, of forced labour through control of third parties and organised crime gangs, and the good practice steps that they can put in place. And I get regular calls from businesses saying, "Oh, we think we've seen something. What should we do?" And those are the ones who actually don't go straight to the sources. So there is signs of positivity, and there's a much greater awareness of this risk of hidden exploitation, how forced labour takes place in businesses and supply chains. And I'm terribly frustrated that it never moves as quickly as I want it to. But if you stop and look back a few years, then there is a much more informed conversation. There are many more businesses that put in place practices to seek to limit risks of forced labour in their business and supply chain. So I'm trying to say something positive, huge way to go, and please come to Stronger Together website, download resources, go to the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit, download the resources. There's a really good guide on eliminating recruitment fees. So come and get these things, and you know, they're all there for free. Thank you.
Okay. Pins, go on. What would you like to say?
Thank you, Claire. I was going to try and answer your question in terms of what do we do, what's the actual impact, right?
Yeah.
But I'm looking at Hannah, and I'm thinking Hannah will have an answer to this question too, and that we're working shared. So perhaps Hannah can add in on the work that we're doing together. Yeah, lots of examples. They're all listed in our modern slavery report. You know, improved wages for 900 people in UK retail, 94% women. Improving wages for that includes agency workers in our distribution centre, all the workers in our distribution centre, our cleaners, our caterers on our head office sites, whole load of other stuff. I mean, still small, as David says, in the grand scheme of global supply chains, but like actual impact for actual numbers of people, both direct and indirect through collaborative action, listed in our modern slavery statement, publicly available on our website. What are our challenges? And then I was going to ask, say to Hannah, the work that we've done together, our whole team who are sustainability and ethical trade people are like in awe of the work, the radio work with our shea nut collectors and butter producers. So
Hannah, I think that's a plug for you.
Thanks for the plug, Pins. And if we're doing unashamable plugs for free resources, then we've created a package of downloadable resources on how to implement your own Farmers Voice Radio project that are available on our website. And we're really trying to get as many people to pick that up and use it within their own supply chains as possible. So yeah, as Pins said, we're working with the Body Shop in Northern Ghana in their shea supply chain. So working, getting together groups of women who are shea nut collectors, who are shea butter producers, to talk about the challenges that they're facing within the supply chain on radio programs. So for example, recently they've been recording radio programs about the importance of quality practices to improve the output of the butter and how that puts you in a better position to be able to negotiate on price. They're not all fortunate enough to be organised or part of a cooperative and have that negotiating platform, but just hearing those voices of their peers on the radio about their experience of understanding better the prices that are available and how having a better appreciation of quality and quality standards can put you in a better negotiating position has really supported their freedom and their choice, I suppose, to engage in that livelihood, which is so vital to them during the lean period. So yeah, when we've got other examples of partnering with other businesses, working with different supply chains to have similar impact. So please do have a look at our resources.
I'm having, I think we've only got 3 minutes left, so we don't have time to ask all of the other questions. I would just like to thank all of the panelists for being here today. We will send you the questions separately. You've been fantastic. Thank you for agreeing to take part. I think I have, have you put up we might not be able to come back and say goodbye to you probably, but I'll just say that this marks the end of the webinar for the Wilberforce Institute. We are going to be sharing this link through our social media platform in due course. So if you want to share this with anyone, they can access it when they want. The next webinar in this series will take place on the 15th of October and will be given by a good friend of ours, John Oldfield, who was also our former director at the Wilberforce Institute. So he'll be talking about rethinking British anti-slavery. And following on from this, in November, we hear from someone else in the world, a Cuban scholar, Manuel Garcia from the University of Leeds, who will be talking about yellow fever pandemics during the 19th century transatlantic slave trade. So thank you all for sending your questions and for being here today. We promise to send the questions to the panelists, and please keep in touch, and let's have any comments or suggestions going forward. Thank you.